The sky over the Arizona territory was the color of old brass, polished by a wind that carried no mercy. It scoured the land, picking up grit and thorns and flinging them against the unpainted planks of Eliza May Calloway's small ranch house. The wind howled a lonesome tune, a song of thirst and survival that Eliza knew by heart. She leaned her whole weight into the task, pulling the thick canvas tarp over the stacked sacks of winter grain. The canvas bucked and snapped like a living thing, fighting her with the storm's borrowed strength. Her knuckles were raw, and dust, fine as iron filings, had worked its way into her hair, her throat, and the deep creases of her soul. Jamie, her son, stood by the cellar door, his small face a pale circle against the darkening afternoon. At 8 years old, he had the same serious eyes as his father, eyes that had seen too much of a hard world too soon. He clutched a wooden horse, its paint worn away by countless imaginary journeys across the parlor floor. She finally lashed the last rope, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Straightening up, she pressed a hand to the small of her back and shouted over the wind's shriek, "Go on down now. Jamie, take the lamp with you." She told him not to light it until she was down there with him. He nodded, his small form disappearing into the dark square of the storm cellar without a word of protest. He was a good boy. He understood the language of storms and lean times. Eliza took one last look across her property. The well, her most precious possession, was securely covered. The chickens were cooped, the lone milk cow safely in the small barn. Everything was as it should be. Battened down against the fury of the sky, the world had been reduced to the gray-brown swirl of the dust storm, an endless churning that erased the horizon and swallowed the sun. It was a world that could make a person feel utterly alone. As she turned toward the house, a shape stumbled out of the roiling curtain of dust. It was a man, staggering, one hand pressed high on his thigh. He took 3 lurching steps toward her porch and then collapsed in a heap, his body limp as a discarded coat. He did not move. For a long moment, Eliza stood frozen, the wind whipping her dress around her legs. Her first instinct was survival, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Trouble didn't just knock in this part of the country, it blew in with the storms and left wreckage behind. Her husband, Tom, had been proof of that. A good man caught in the crossfire of a posse's mistake. The law, she had learned, was a clumsy instrument, often breaking the very things it was meant to protect. Her hand went to the shotgun that was always leaning just inside the door. She pulled it into the crook of her arm, the familiar weight of the walnut stock a small comfort. She walked slowly toward the porch, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The man was lying face down. Dark blood was soaking through the coarse fabric of his trousers, a stain spreading like a terrible secret. In his left hand, he clutched a small, tattered piece of telegraph wire, the metal glinting dully against his skin. She nudged his shoulder with the toe of her boot. He groaned, a low rasp of sound almost lost in the wind. He was alive. That complicated things. A dead man was a problem for the coroner. A living one was a problem for her. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the whole unforgiving landscape, she knelt beside him. She rolled him over. His face was caked with dust and streaked with sweat, a map of exhaustion and pain. He looked to be in his early 30s, with a strong jaw hidden under a few days of dark stubble. His eyes fluttered open, hazy and unfocused. They were a surprising shade of gray, like a cloudy sky just before a rain. He tried to speak, but only a dry crackle came out. Eliza stood up and walked back into the house. Leaving him on the porch, her mind was a whirlwind. Taking him in was a risk, a huge one. But leaving him out here, the storm would finish what the bullet had started. She thought of Tom, bleeding out on a dusty street with no one to offer a kind hand. The memory was a sharp pain in her chest. She returned with the shotgun held loosely in one hand and a dipper of water in the other. She knelt again and lifted his head, holding the cool metal to his lips. He drank greedily, water spilling down his chin. When the dipper was empty, he sagged back against the boards. His gaze cleared for a moment, focusing on the twin barrels of the shotgun pointed vaguely at his chest. A flicker of something, maybe humor, crossed his features. She leaned closer to hear him over the wind, her own voice coming out low and steady. "Do not think for a moment that this dust storm will make me miss, Mr." The man's lips twitched into a faint smile. He managed a whisper. "A fair warning, ma'am." The decision was made, not with her head, but with some deeper part of her that still believed in simple decency, even out here where it was a scarce commodity. With a grunt of effort, she hauled him up, draping one of his arms over her shoulders. He was heavier than he looked, all solid muscle and bone. She half dragged, half carried him into the small house, kicking the door shut against the howling dust. She laid him on the rag rug in front of the cold hearth. The wound was bad. A clean hole through the fleshy part of his thigh. It was bleeding sluggishly, but it needed to be cleaned and stitched if he was to have any chance. She lit a lamp, the yellow glow pushing back the storm's gloom, and went to work. From her small pantry, she brought back a bottle of corn liquor, a needle, and a spool of thick thread. She tore a strip from a clean flour sack for a bandage. She looked down at him. His eyes were closed again. "This is going to hurt," she told him, more to steady her own nerves than his. He gave a slight nod. She poured the liquor over the wound. The man's entire body went rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped the rug. A choked sound escaped his lips, but he made no other cry. Eliza took a deep breath, threaded the needle, and began to stitch the torn flesh back together. Her hands were deft and sure, the same hands that mended Jamie's clothes and her own. This was just another kind of tear in the fabric of things, a more serious one. As she worked, she heard it, a sound distinct from the storm, the rhythmic beat of horses' hooves, coming closer. A posse. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She took a final stitch and knotted the thread, her movements quickening with a surge of adrenaline. She looked around the small room. There was nowhere to hide him, except one place, the loose floorboards near the hearth, where Tom used to keep his emergency money. She grabbed the man's arm. "You have to get under the floor, now!" His gray eyes opened. Sharp and alert this time despite the pain. He understood immediately. He used his good leg and his arms to push himself toward the spot she indicated. Eliza pried up the boards with the tip of a fireplace poker. The space below was dark and smelled of damp earth. It was not much, but it would have to do. He slid into the narrow opening just as a loud banging rattled the front door. Eliza dropped the boards back into place, slid the rug over them, and kicked a bit of dirt from the hearth to obscure the seams. She took a moment to smooth her hair and wipe the sweat from her brow, then walked to the door, the shotgun once again in her hand. She opened it a crack. 3 men on horseback sat facing her, their faces wrapped in bandanas against the dust. They wore badges that glinted in the dim light. Deputies' badges, but they did not have the look of the law. They had the hard, predatory eyes of men who worked for a paycheck, not for justice. One of them, a thick-set man with a florid face, leaned down from his saddle. "Ma'am, we are looking for a fugitive. Saw a trail leading this way. You seen anyone pass through?" Eliza kept her expression neutral. "It is a bit hard to see anything in this storm. Gentlemen, what business would a fugitive have out here?" The man's eyes narrowed. Scanning the front of her house, the business of running, he was wounded, shot in the leg. "We would like to take a look inside your house." "For your own safety, of course." Eliza's grip tightened on the shotgun. She did not raise it, but its presence was a clear statement. "My safety is my own concern, and I can assure you, there is no one here but my son and myself. He is in the cellar, if you would like to check there." The man grunted, unimpressed. He gestured toward the ground. "We will check everywhere. The house, the barn, even under the floorboards if we have to." A spark of defiance flared in Eliza's chest, a slow, hot anger. She let a small, humorless smile touch her lips. You gentlemen truly prefer crawling around under a woman's floorboards to the actual business of finding justice. I would have thought deputies of the law had better things to do with their time. The man's face darkened with irritation. For a tense moment, she thought he might dismount and force his way in. His companions shifted uneasily in their saddles. The wind tore at them, a constant, abrasive force. Finally, the leader seemed to decide it was not worth the trouble. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that the wind immediately whipped away. Fine, have it your way, widow. But if we find out you are harboring him, the law will not be so polite next time. He wheeled his horse around, and the three of them rode off, quickly becoming ghosts swallowed by the swirling brown maelstrom. Eliza closed the door, her back pressing against the solid wood. Her knees felt weak. She waited, listening, until the sound of the hooves was completely gone, erased by the storm. Only then did she move. She pulled the rug back and lifted the floorboards. The man was lying still in the darkness. She helped him out, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. She got him onto her own bed, a luxury she could not afford but offered anyway. He was shivering. So she built up the fire in the hearth until the small room was filled with a welcome warmth. She sat in a chair beside the bed, the shotgun laid across her lap, and watched him as the storm raged outside. Hours passed. The wind's howl eventually softened to a mournful sigh, and the constant grit against the window panes lessened. Just before dawn, when the world was a palette of soft grays, he stirred. His eyes opened and found hers in the dim light. They were clear. "Thank you," he said, his voice a raw whisper. She just nodded. "Who are you?" she asked. "What have you done?" He looked at the ceiling for a long moment before answering, "My name is Cole, and what I have done depends on who you ask." His gaze returned to her, and there was a deep weariness in it, a sadness that went beyond his physical wound. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his expression grim. "You have shown me a great kindness, ma'am. You should know what you have gotten yourself into." He paused, gathering his strength. "You are only saving a wounded man tonight, but I promise you, come morning, you will see I'm the man they have labeled most wanted." The morning broke clean and quiet, the air washed by the storm. The sun, a pale disk in a soft blue sky, cast long shadows across a landscape that seemed to have been scrubbed new. The dust was gone, settled into a damp, dark layer on the earth. Eliza stood on her porch, breathing in the smell of wet creosote and rain-soaked soil. It was a peaceful scene, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had taken root inside her house. Jamie came running from the direction of town, his small legs pumping, kicking up little bursts of mud. He usually took his time on the trip back from Mesquite Ford, where he delivered fresh eggs to Nora June at the inn. But today, he ran with an urgency that sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Eliza. He was waving a piece of paper, a large sheet that flapped in the morning breeze. He skidded to a stop at the bottom of the porch steps, his face flushed and his breathing ragged. "Mama, look what they put up, all over town." He held the paper out to her. Eliza's hands trembled slightly as she took it. The paper was coarse, the printing stark and black. At the top, in thick, menacing letters, were the words, "Most Wanted." Below them was a crude drawing of a man's face, a sketch that managed to capture the hard lines of a jaw and a pair of steady eyes. It was a poor likeness, but it was unmistakably the man sleeping in her bed. And beneath the drawing, the name, Cole Hart. The poster accused him of murder and robbery, offering a reward of $500, a sum that could change a person's life or end it. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Every fear from the night before came rushing back. A cold, sickening flood. Murder, robbery. She was harboring a killer. Jamie was in the house with a killer. She stared at the poster, the words blurring together. The official story, printed in black ink for all the world to see and believe. just like the official story that had branded her Tom a renegade before the truth was sorted out, long after it was too late to matter. A voice from inside the house cut through her panic. It was weak, but clear. "I imagine that is for me." Eliza turned and walked back into the house, the wanted poster crinkling in her tight grip. Cole was propped up on his elbows, his face etched with pain, but his gray eyes lucid. Jamie followed his mother, staying close to her skirts, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination as he looked at the man from the poster. Eliza held up the sheet of paper. "Is this true?" Cole's gaze did not waver. "The rest is a lie." He slowly swung his good leg over the side of the bed, his jaw tight against a fresh stab of pain from his wounded thigh. He told them what had happened, his voice low and raspy but gaining strength as he spoke. He was the acting sheriff for the county, appointed after the last one had died of a fever. He had been investigating the affairs of Barrett Pike, a wealthy rancher who was buying up land and water rights with a ruthlessness that was strangling the smaller homesteads. "The man I supposedly murdered," he continued. "His name was Simon Wheeler. He was a clerk for Pike. And he had proof. Ledgers, shipping manifests, letters. Proof that Pike was using hired guns to intimidate people and had bribed a federal land surveyor. Simon was going to give it all to me, but my deputy, Wade Lyle, got to him first. Lyle works for Pike. It was an ambush. They killed Simon and tried to kill me. Lyle sent out the telegraph message himself, naming me as the killer. Before I could get to the line, that piece of wire I was holding, I cut it from the pole before I passed out, hoping it would be enough to show it had been tampered with." Eliza listened, her mind racing. It was a complicated story, a story of corruption and betrayal that felt all too plausible in this territory. But it was just that, a story. A man would say anything to save his own skin. She looked from Cole's earnest, pained face to the bold letters on the poster, "Most Wanted." The law had spoken, and the law had been wrong before. It had been fatally wrong for Tom. That memory was the thing that held her back, the ghost that whispered warnings in her ear. She hated the cold certainty of a lawman's handcuffs more than she feared a common thief. A thief just took your property. The law, when it was mistaken, could take a man's life and call it justice. She felt a small tug on her sleeve. Jamie was looking up at her, his expression serious. "Mama, is he a bad man?" Eliza looked down at her son, and then back at Cole. The man on the bed did not look like a killer. He looked like a man who was tired, in pain, and utterly alone. There was a quiet gentleness in his eyes, a calmness that did not fit the brutal crimes listed on the poster. Her own heart, a compass she had learned to trust more than any map or decree, was pointing in a direction that defied all common sense. Cole's mouth was dry. He tried to swallow. "Ma'am, could I trouble you for some water, and maybe some of that tea I smelled earlier?" He offered a weak, crooked smile. If this is the afterlife, at least the angel at the gate makes good tea. The unexpected flash of humor broke the spell. It was such a human thing to say, so out of place in the middle of this life or death situation. A small, dry chuckle escaped Eliza's lips before she could stop it. She went to the stove and poured a cup of the chicory brew she had made at dawn. "This angel charges a fee," she said, her voice sharp but without its earlier edge. "And that fee is your silence. You need to rest." She handed him the cup, her fingers brushing his. He drank it slowly, gratefully. The simple act of giving him the drink was a decision. It was an acceptance. She was in this now, whether she liked it or not. She turned to her son. "Jamie, I need you to be a brave boy. This man is in trouble, and we are going to help him, but no one can know he is here. Not a soul. Do you understand?" Jamie nodded solemnly. "It is our secret." Her next move was practical. He could not stay in the house. It was the first place they would look if they came back. The old horse stable, at the far end of the property, was a better option. It had not been used in years, but it was sturdy and dry. It would be less comfortable, but much safer. Getting him there was a challenge. He leaned heavily on her, his face beaded with sweat, every step an agony. They moved slowly across the yard, the bright morning sun feeling like a spotlight. They finally reached the stable, the air inside cool and smelling of old hay and leather. She made a pallet for him in an empty stall, piling old blankets on a bed of clean straw. He collapsed onto it, his breath hissing through his teeth. She left him with a canteen of water and a promise to return with food, then hurried back to the house, her mind already on the next problem. The wound. Her stitching was crude at best. It needed proper medical attention or infection would set in, and there was only one person she trusted for that. She saddled her mare, her movements efficient and purposeful. She rode into Mesquite Ford, avoiding the main street where men were gathered in small groups, talking and gesturing at the new wanted posters. She took the back alley to a small adobe house with a garden of herbs growing by the door. This was the home of Luisa Ortega. Luisa was a healer, a woman who carried the wisdom of two peoples in her blood. Her mother had been Apache, her father a doctor from Mexico City. She had her father's knowledge of medicine and her mother's knowledge of the desert's remedies. She was a woman who lived in the space between worlds, trusted by many but truly belonging to none. She greeted Eliza with a warm, knowing smile. "I had a feeling I would see you today. Eliza May. The whole town is buzzing like a disturbed beehive. Come in." Inside, the house was filled with the scent of drying herbs. Eliza quickly explained the situation, her words tumbling out in a hushed, urgent rush. Louisa listened patiently, her dark eyes never leaving Eliza's face. When Eliza had finished, the healer simply nodded. "A man's life is a man's life," she said softly. "It does not matter what the posters say. Let me gather my things." They rode back to the ranch together. Louisa's examination of Cole was swift and professional. She cleaned the wound again, her touch gentle but firm, and applied a poultice of powdered herbs that she promised would draw out any fever. "The stitching is not pretty," she told Eliza as she bandaged the leg with fresh cloth. "But it will hold. The real danger now is infection. He needs to stay off this leg completely. He needs rest, clean water, and food. I will come back tomorrow to check on him." After Louisa had gone, Eliza sat on a hay bale in the stable, watching the late afternoon light filter through the cracks in the wooden walls. Cole was asleep, his breathing deep and even for the first time. The world was quiet again. She looked at the man she had rescued, this gentle sheriff with a price on his head. She thought about the poster, the posse, the web of lies and greed he described. Her simple, difficult life had suddenly become dangerously complicated. She spoke the words aloud to the still, dusty air, a bitter truth that she was just beginning to accept. "I saved a stranger from the storm, and it turns out he is the gentlest sheriff to ever wear a badge, with a most wanted sign hanging over his head." She shook her head slowly. Life sure has a cruel sense of humor. For 2 days, Cole Hart was a ghost in the old stable. He drifted in and out of a fevered sleep, his world shrinking to the shafts of dusty light that sliced through the weathered planks, the taste of chicory tea, and the quiet, efficient movements of the woman who was risking everything for him. Eliza brought him broth and bread, her face a mask of worried practicality. Jamie would sometimes peer around the edge of the stall, his eyes full of questions he knew not to ask, before his mother would gently shoo him away. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Cole woke to a clarity that was both a blessing and a curse. His leg throbbed with a dull, insistent rhythm, but his mind was sharp, and it was churning with the injustice of his situation. He was a prisoner of his own wounded body. When Eliza came with his morning meal, she found him sitting up, his back against the rough wood of the stall, scratching diagrams in the dirt floor with a stick. "That telegraph line is the key," he said without preamble, his voice stronger than she had heard it. "Lyle is smart, but he is also arrogant. He would not have ridden all the way to the next county to send his message. He would have found a way to cut into the main line somewhere close by. There is a junction pole near the new railway depot, where the spur line to the mining camp branches off. He would have done it there. Eliza set the tray down on a hay bale. And what good does that do us? You can hardly walk to the door, let alone to town. I know, he said, his frustration a raw edge in his voice. But you can. I need you to be my eyes. I need you to go there and look. Find that pole. Look for signs of fresh work. Scuff marks from climbing spurs. Disturbed earth at the base. And look at the wire itself, where it connects to the insulators. Lyle would have had to cut the main wire and splice in a new piece to send his own signal. The splice would be newer, cleaner than the old, weathered wire around it. It would be a small thing, but it would be proof. She looked at the lines he had drawn in the dirt, a map of his own profession, a world of codes and currents she did not understand. But she understood the logic. It was a long shot, a needle in a haystack, but it was something. It was better than just waiting for Pike's men to come back. I cannot go alone. People will notice. People will talk. Cole nodded, his gaze distant. There are 2 people in Mesquite Ford who might help. Nora June at the inn. Her tongue is sharp, but her heart is in the right place, and she despises Barrett Pike more than she fears him. And then there is Hank, the blind musician. What can he do? Cole's expression softened. Hank hears things other people miss, the sound of a horse that is shod for mountain trails, not town roads, the weight of a man's footsteps. People forget he is there and they talk freely. He sees more with his ears than most men do with their eyes. He is a good man. You can trust him. Eliza considered it. Nora June was a gossip, but a loyal one if you were on her good side. And Hank, everyone loved Hank. He was a fixture on the porch of the general store, his old guitar across his lap, a man who seemed to exist outside the town's petty squabbles. It was a strange and unlikely trio of conspirators, a reclusive widow, a tart-tongued innkeeper, and a blind balladeer. She left Cole with a fresh canteen and a warning to stay put, then rode into town. She found Nora June sweeping the boardwalk in front of the Juniper House, her movements brisk and agitated. Well, look what the storm blew in, Nora said, not unkindly. I was wondering when you would show your face. Town is in an uproar. A murdering sheriff. Who ever heard of such a thing? Eliza drew her friend inside, away from prying ears, in the dim quiet of the empty saloon. She told her everything. Nora listened, her sharp features growing more and more grim. When Eliza finished, Nora leaned back against the bar and let out a long, low whistle. You have a wanted man in your stable, a man accused of murder, Eliza May Calloway. You have lost your senses. They will hang him, and they will run you out of the territory for helping him. He is innocent. Nora, I know he is. Nora studied her friend's face for a long moment. Then she sighed, a sound of profound exasperation. You always did have a soft spot for strays. And I will admit, Barrett Pike getting his way sticks in my craw. Fine, I will help you. What do you need? They found Hank on his usual stool, humming a tune as he polished the worn wood of his guitar. Eliza knelt beside him and spoke quietly, explaining Cole's theory about the telegraph wire. Hank did not say a word until she was finished. He sat in silence for a full minute, his unseeing eyes turned toward the street. Then he nodded slowly. The night Simon Wheeler was killed, he said, his voice a low rumble. I was sitting right here. It was late. I heard a wagon. It was moving fast, too fast for a town wagon, and it was heavy. It had the sound of a freight wagon, the kind the railroad uses for carrying heavy equipment. It turned down the track toward the depot. I remember thinking it was odd, because there was no train due. Eliza and Nora exchanged a look. It was the corroboration they needed. The 3 of them made a plan. Nora would start a loud argument with a delivery driver in front of the inn, creating a spectacle that would draw the attention of anyone loafing on the main street. While the town was distracted, Eliza and Hank would slip away to the railway depot. The plan worked perfectly. Nora's manufactured outrage was a masterful performance. As half the town gathered to watch, Eliza led Hank down a quiet alleyway. They walked together, her hand on his arm, guiding him over the ruts in the road. They found the junction pole just where Cole had said it would be. It stood alone, a stark cross against the sky. "Now for the hard part," Eliza muttered, looking up at the tangle of wires. She was not a natural climber, but desperation gave her strength. She hitched up her skirts and began to pull herself up the pole, using the iron pegs as handholds. The wood was rough against her palms. Below, Hank stood as still as a statue, his head tilted, listening. "It is just as he said," she called down, her voice tight with excitement. "There is a new piece of wire. It is shiny. The soldering is clumsy, not like the other connections." Hank, meanwhile, was running his sensitive fingertips over the base of the pole. They found it, a small glass insulator, half buried in the dirt, dropped by a man in a hurry, a man working in the dark. They had their proof. It was small, fragile, but it was a start, a crack in the wall of lies that Lyle and Pike had built. When Eliza returned to the stable, her heart was lighter than it had been in days. Cole was awake, pacing the narrow confines of the stall like a caged animal, putting weight on his wounded leg. The bandage was spotted with fresh blood. "Did you find it?" he asked, his eyes burning with intensity. She told him everything, about the wire, the insulator, Hank's story about the wagon. A look of profound relief washed over his face. "It is a start. It is something I can use." Then he winced and leaned against the stall door, his face pale. "You are bleeding," she said, her voice sharp with alarm and anger. "I told you to rest." "What were you thinking?" He pushed himself upright, his jaw set stubbornly. "I was thinking that every minute I lie here is another minute for them to cover their tracks. I have to get out of here. I have to get this evidence to the territorial marshal in Prescott. My name is being dragged through the mud. Eliza, it is all I have left." "You will do no good to anyone if you bleed to death in my stable," she shot back, her own frustration boiling over. "You are a fool if you think you can ride for 5 minutes, let alone 5 days. You will stay here until you are healed." The air in the small space crackled with tension. They stood facing each other, two stubborn wills locked in a battle of his desperate need for justice against her desperate need to keep him alive. The argument was cut short by a small voice from the doorway. Jamie stood there, holding a piece of braided leather. He had been working on it for days. A simple 3-strand plait made from an old rein. He walked slowly toward Cole, his small face serious, and held it out. "Here," he said, "so you can remember that this is a safe place." The simple, profound innocence of the gift shattered the anger. Cole stared at the small leather strap in Jamie's hand, then looked at the boy's earnest face. A wave of emotion washed over him, so powerful it made him unsteady. He reached out and took the braid, his large, rough hand closing over Jamie's small one for a moment. "Thank you, Jamie," he said, his voice thick. "I will not forget." Eliza's anger melted away, replaced by a warmth that spread through her chest. She looked at this wounded, hunted man, and saw not a fugitive, but a person of deep integrity, a man who had earned her son's trust. That night, the temperature plummeted. A hard frost settled over the land, silvering the sparse grass and putting a sharp, brittle edge on the air. Eliza was woken from a shallow sleep by the frantic squawking of her chickens. A moment later, the cow in the barn let out a low, distressed bellow. Coyotes. The cold and the hunger had made them bold. She grabbed the shotgun and a heavy shawl and ran outside. The moon was a sliver of ice in a black sky. She could see them, a pack of 4 or 5, lean, shadowy shapes circling the barn. She fired a round into the air. The blast echoed across the silent landscape. The coyotes scattered, but she knew they would be back. She stood guard between the house and the barn, the cold seeping into her bones, the shotgun heavy in her arms. The stable door creaked open. Cole was standing there, leaning on a thick branch he was using as a crutch. He was wearing an old coat of Tom's that she had given him, and his breath plumed in the frigid air. "2 guards are better than 1, he said, his voice a low rasp. "You will kill yourself," she hissed, rushing over to him. "Get back inside." He shook his head, his face a pale mask in the moonlight. "This is my fight, too. They are here because of me." He took a determined step forward, lost his balance on the uneven ground, and started to fall. Eliza caught him, her slight frame straining under his weight. He was shivering, not just from the cold, but from the strain and the pain. His attempt to help, his foolish, noble gesture, was the final piece of her conviction. She no longer had any doubt. She helped him back into the relative warmth of the stable, his arm draped over her shoulder, his body leaning heavily against hers. The coyotes, perhaps sensing 2 determined humans instead of 1, had melted back into the darkness. Inside, she checked his bandage. It was clean, but he was flushed with a new fever from the exertion. As she adjusted the blankets around him, their hands touched. His fingers were cold, but they curled around hers for just a moment. A silent acknowledgement. A thank you. In that quiet touch, a new understanding passed between them. Something deeper than gratitude or pity. It was a fragile seed of trust and affection, planted in the harshest of soils. Eliza sat with him until his breathing evened out into a deep sleep. She thought of Hank and his ballads. She could almost hear the gentle strum of his guitar on the cold night air, weaving a new song, a ballad of the man saved not by powder or a doctor's skilled hands, she thought, but by the stubborn kindness of a heart that refused to believe the lies. The fragile peace on Eliza's homestead lasted less than a week. The new trouble did not arrive with the sound of hoofbeats or the blast of a shotgun, but with a profound and terrifying silence. The small creek that ran along the southern edge of her property, the same creek that fed the handful of other small ranches in the valley, had dwindled to a muddy trickle. By the next morning, it was nothing but a cracked, sun-baked scar on the land. Word traveled as fast as a prairie fire. Barrett Pike had dammed the headwaters up in the canyon, cutting off the lifeblood of the valley. It was a move as brutal and final as putting a lock on the only well in a desert. The message was clear: sell your land to him for pennies on the dollar, or watch your lives wither and blow away with the dust. The first to be broken were the Romeros, a family of Apache and Mexican heritage who farmed a small plot down by the river bend. They were good people who kept to themselves, but their claim to the land was older than the territory itself, and Pike wanted it. One evening, a wagon rattled up Eliza's lane. It was the Romero family. Their few worldly possessions piled in the back: a rocking chair, a few crates, a cage of chickens. "Mister." Romero's face was a stoic mask of grief, but his wife's eyes were full of a silent, burning despair. Pike's men had come, they explained in quiet, broken English. They had offered a pittance, and when Mr. Romero refused, they had simply driven his cattle off and told him his family would be next if they were not gone by sundown. Watching them leave, a small, sad caravan heading toward a future of uncertainty, solidified something in Eliza. The fear that had kept her isolated for so long burned away, leaving behind a hard, cold anger. This was not the random cruelty of nature. This was the calculated cruelty of a greedy man. That afternoon, she gathered her neighbors. They met at her ranch, drawn by the one thing they all needed: the deep, reliable water of her well. The men were grim-faced and angry, their talk turning to rifles and a night ride to Pike's ranch. Eliza listened, her hands clenched at her sides. She had seen where that kind of talk led. It led to men like her Tom, dead in the street. When they had talked themselves into a furious, helpless silence, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension. "Riding against Pike is what he wants. He has a dozen hired guns. We have families. We will not win with bullets, but we might win with shovels." She pointed toward the low hills to the east. "There is a spring up there. It is not much, but it runs year-round. If we dig a ditch, an irrigation channel, we could bring that water down to our fields. It would be enough to keep our livestock alive and our crops from failing completely. The men looked at her, then at each other, skepticism warring with desperation. It was miles of digging, through hard, rocky soil. It seemed an impossible task. But the women understood. It was work. Hard, back-breaking work. But it was a chance. It was a way to fight back that did not involve widows and orphans. One by one, they voiced their support. The men, outmaneuvered by this sudden alliance of practicality, reluctantly agreed. The next morning, a small army of women and children, with a handful of husbands and older sons, arrived at the spring with shovels, picks, and buckets. Eliza, her face set with determination, marked a line in the dirt with the heel of her boot, and the work began. Cole watched from the shade of the stable, his heart a strange mixture of pride and helplessness. He was still too weak to do more than walk a few dozen yards at a time, but he could not stay idle. He limped out to the edge of the work area, leaning on his branch crutch. "Pike will not let this happen," he said to Eliza as she paused to wipe the sweat from her brow. "He will send men to stop you." "I know," she said, her eyes on the line of digging that was slowly snaking its way down the hillside. "You need to be ready, not to fight, but to stand your ground. There is a discipline to it." He gathered the older boys and the few men around him. He taught them how to stand in a line, shoulder to shoulder, presenting a unified, unmoving front. He taught them how to use a shovel handle or a pickaxe to block, to parry, to disarm, without striking a blow. And he repeated one rule, over and over again. No matter what they say, no matter what they do, you do not throw the first punch. You do not fire the first shot. We are defending our homes, not attacking them. The law is on our side. Even if the men wearing the badges are not, let them be the aggressors. Let them be the ones to break the peace. His voice was calm, authoritative. He was a lawman again, not a fugitive. He was leading, even while standing still. Luisa Ortega arrived in the afternoon, her saddlebags filled not only with medical supplies, but with food and water for the workers. She went first to the Romero's abandoned homestead, hoping to salvage any medicinal plants they might have left behind in their small garden. She found the place ransacked. The door kicked in, a few pieces of broken pottery littering the floor. As she was about to leave, she noticed a loose floorboard in the corner of the single room. Her curiosity piqued. She pried it up. Beneath it lay a small, leather-bound ledger. She brought it straight to Eliza. They opened it together in the stable, away from the others. The book was filled with Simon Wheeler's neat, precise handwriting. It was a meticulous record of Barrett Pike's secret business. There were lists of payments to land surveyors, to freight agents, and to Deputy Wade Lyle. And then they found it. Near the back, a carbon copy of a freight order, dated the night of Simon's murder. It was a request for 2 crates of fencing wire and 1 of blasting powder, to be delivered to the rail depot and held for pickup. It was the heavy equipment Hank had heard in the wagon. The final line of the entry was a note, "Hold for W.N.L. Wade Lyle." It was the physical evidence that tied the deputy, the murder, and Pike's business dealings together in one neat, undeniable knot. The sun was setting by the time the weary workers trudged home, leaving behind a raw, earthen trench that stretched nearly a quarter of a mile. Eliza sat on the edge of her porch, every muscle in her body aching. The day's small victory felt immense. Cole came and sat beside her, moving carefully, his crutch resting against the porch railing. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sky bleed from orange to purple over the distant mesas. "This country takes so much," Eliza said softly, not looking at him. "It took my husband. It feels like it is always trying to take something more." Cole nodded. "I know." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I became a lawman because I saw a man hanged for stealing a horse he did not steal. I was just a boy. I saw the fear in his eyes, and I saw the arrogance in the eyes of the man who accused him. I decided then that the law ought to be about the truth, not about who has the loudest voice or the deepest pockets." Eliza finally turned to look at him. His profile was stark against the fading light. My Tom, he believed in the law, too. He thought it would protect him. He was helping a marshal track a rustler, and another posse mistook him for the man they were hunting. They shot him down without a word. The marshal cleared his name a week later. A week too late. That is why I do not trust badges. Cole. Sometimes they are just pieces of tin that give a man an excuse to stop thinking. She was rubbing her sore shoulder, her fingers kneading the tight muscles. He saw the weariness in her, the deep, abiding grief she carried with such quiet strength. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand gently covering hers, stilling its movement. I am sorry. Eliza, he said, his voice low and full of a genuine sorrow that reached a place in her that had been numb for years. His hand was warm and strong over hers. It was not a gesture of romance, but of pure, simple human comfort, a shared understanding of loss, of the fight to hold on to something decent in an indecent world. They sat like that as darkness fell, their hands clasped together, two lonely souls finding a fragile anchor in the vast, unforgiving silence of the West. The moment was broken by the mundane need for supper. As she stood up, her muscles protesting, she looked down at the lawmen sitting on her porch. Well, Sheriff, she said, a hint of a tease in her voice. All this digging and planning is one thing, but I have got a cord of wood that needs splitting for the winter. You any good with an axe? A rare, small smile touched his lips. He looked down at his bandaged leg. I confess, ma'am, my talents do not lie in that direction. He met her gaze, a twinkle in his gray eyes. I chop up criminal case files much better than I chop firewood. The quiet determination of the ditch diggers had unsettled Barrett Pike more than an armed revolt would have. An army of shovels was an opponent he did not understand. It was a slow, stubborn force of will, and it was succeeding. He needed chaos, a spectacle of violence that would terrify the homesteaders back into submission and simultaneously flush out the man he was hunting. He found his solution in a hired gun named Sable Quinn, a man who moved with a reptilian stillness and whose only allegiance was to the highest bidder. The attack came at night, under the cover of a dry, gusty wind that rattled windows and sent tumbleweeds racing through the empty streets of Mesquite Ford. Eliza was woken not by a sound, but by an unnatural orange light that flickered against her bedroom wall. She rose and went to the window. In the distance, above the dark silhouette of the town, the night sky was pulsing with a malevolent, fiery glow. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. It was in the center of town. It was big. It was the Juniper House. Nora. And Jamie. He had begged to stay the night with Nora June after a day of helping her restock shelves, a small reward for his hard work on the irrigation ditch. Eliza's heart seized in her chest. She was dressed in moments, pulling on her boots, her mind a blank slate of pure terror. As she ran for the door, a figure blocked her path. It was Cole, awake and already dressed, his face grim in the hellish, distant light. His limp was more pronounced, but his eyes were clear and steady. You are not going alone, he said. It was not a question. I have to. Jamie is there. The words were a choked whisper. Then we both have to. He grabbed the old shotgun from its place by the door and followed her out into the windy night. The ride into town was a nightmare of flying sparks and choking smoke. The wind, a neutral force of nature, had become a willing accomplice to the arsonist, fanning the flames and carrying the fire from the main building to the attached livery. By the time they arrived, the Juniper House was a roaring beast of fire, its windows blown out, its roof sagging, spitting embers into the dark sky. A crowd had gathered. There faced the gallery of horror and fascination in the flickering light. They were a shapeless mass of fear and anger, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Eliza pushed her way through, screaming Nora's name. A figure stumbled out of the smoke, coughing, her face black with soot, her hair singed. It was Nora June. Nora, thank God! Where is he? Where is Jamie? Eliza gripped her friend's arms. Nora's eyes were wide with panic. He was in the attic room. The back stairs were already on fire. I could not get to him. The words were torn from her throat. Eliza's world collapsed. A wave of blackness threatened to pull her under. At that moment, a man in the crowd, one of Pike's ranch hands she recognized, pointed a finger at Cole, who stood just behind Eliza, his face a grim mask.
"It is him! It is Hart, the fugitive! He did this! The accusation shouted with authority! Was the spark the keg needed!"
The crowd turned, their fear finding a target. The murmur swelled into a roar. "Get him! Hang the murdering devil!" They started to surge forward, their collective anger erasing all reason. Cole did not even look at them. His eyes were fixed on the burning building, on the small attic window where a boy's life was in peril. He pushed the shotgun into Eliza's numb hands. "Keep them back," he said, his voice low and urgent. Then he turned and ran toward the inferno. He moved with a desperate, painful gait, his wounded legs screaming in protest, but he did not slow. He kicked in the front door, which hung crookedly on its hinges, and disappeared into the swirling smoke and chaos. The crowd faltered, confused. Their villain was not running away. He was running into the fire. Eliza stood her ground, the shotgun held across her chest, her eyes blazing with a mother's feral terror and a newfound, absolute faith. "Stay back," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. "All of you, stay back." Inside the burning inn, the heat was a physical blow. The air was thick with smoke that clawed at Cole's throat and burned his eyes. The main staircase was a wall of flame. He remembered Nora mentioning a small service stairwell in the back, near the kitchen. He found it, the wood already smoldering, and took the steps 2 at a time, ignoring the searing pain in his thigh. The second floor was a labyrinth of smoke and collapsing timbers. He shouted Jamie's name, his voice hoarse. A small, terrified cough answered him from the end of the hall. He followed the sound to a narrow door that led to the attic. The handle was hot to the touch, but he wrenched it open and scrambled up the steep steps. Jamie was huddled in a corner, crying, his face streaked with soot. Cole scooped him up. "It is all right, son. I have got you." As he turned to go back down, a massive ceiling joist, eaten through by the fire, crashed down, blocking the stairwell in a shower of sparks and flaming debris. They were trapped. The smoke was thickening, stealing the air from their lungs. Cole looked around wildly. There was one small window at the far end of the attic, overlooking the alley. He staggered toward it, carrying Jamie, who was now coughing weakly in his arms. He smashed the window with his elbow and leaned out, gulping the relatively clean night air. They were 2 stories up. The livery roof was below them, a steep, treacherous slope already beginning to smoke. There was no other choice. Shielding Jamie's head with his arm, Cole swung them out of the window, his boots scrabbling for a hold on the hot shingles. He held the boy tight against his chest, turning his own back to the main building, to the worst of the heat. A sheet of flame erupted from the window they had just exited, licking at his back and setting his coat smoldering. He ignored the searing pain and began to slide down the steep pitch of the roof, using his own body as a sled to protect the child. They hit the edge of the roof and tumbled over, landing hard in a pile of hay that had been scattered from the burning livery. For a moment, Cole lay there, the wind knocked out of him, his entire body a symphony of pain. Then he heard Jamie cough, a real lung-clearing cough, and nothing else mattered. He struggled to his feet, lifting the boy into his arms, and stumbled out of the alley and back into the street. The crowd, which had been held at bay by Eliza's fierce standoff, fell completely silent. They saw the figure emerge from the smoke, a man, limping badly, his back smoking, his face black with soot. And in his arms, he carried the child, safe, the wanted man, the murderer, the hero. The labels, the accusations, the entire narrative that had been fed to them, it all dissolved in the face of what they were seeing. They had been ready to hang him, and he had walked through fire to save one of their children. Eliza ran to him, her heart restarting in her chest. She took Jamie from his arms, holding her son so tight he grunted in protest. She looked at Cole, at the raw, blistering burn that was visible on his neck and the back of his hand, at the smoking fabric on his back, and her eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the smoke. Luisa Ortega was already there, pushing her way through the now subdued and shamed crowd. She took charge immediately, leading them away from the fire, to the relative safety of the general store porch. She examined Jamie first, declaring him shaken and full of smoke, but otherwise unharmed. Then she turned her attention to Cole. She carefully cut away the smoldering remains of his coat, her face grim as she revealed the angry red burn that covered most of his back. Jamie, recovering his wits with the resilience of a child, looked up at the man who had saved him. His small face was serious, but his eyes were bright with an unwavering adoration. "Uncle Cole most wanted," he said, his voice a little hoarse, "is probably most wanted by me, for playing bottle caps tomorrow." A few people in the crowd, who had followed and were watching from a distance, heard him. A ripple of nervous, relieved laughter went through them. The tension was broken, replaced by a profound sense of awe and gratitude. Later, as Louisa was applying a soothing salve to Cole's burns, Nora June sat with them, wrapped in a borrowed blanket. Her face was grim, her sharp wit momentarily silenced by the loss of her home and business. "It was him," she said suddenly, her voice low and hard. "Wade Lyle. I did not think anything of it before, but he was always coming around, late at night. Said he was checking the doors, doing his rounds, but he always went out back, toward the rail depot. I saw him a dozen times, slipping in and out of the telegraph office when it was supposed to be locked up for the night." Cole, gritting his teeth as Louisa worked, looked at Eliza. Their eyes met, the telegraph office, the clumsy splice, Hank's freight wagon, and now Lyle's late-night visits. All the pieces were clicking into place. The depot was the hub of the conspiracy. And Nora's revelation had just pointed them toward their next move, toward the place where the truth was hidden. A place as dry and dangerous as its name, Dry Bone Canyon. The journey to Dry Bone Canyon was a descent into the territory's harshest heart. The wind was a physical thing, a hot, scouring force that felt like a whip against their exposed skin and drove grit into their eyes and teeth. The sun was a hammer in a brass sky, beating down on the scorched rock and sparse, thorny vegetation. The trail, little more than a goat path, wound through a maze of steep mesas and shadowy arroyos where the dry whisper of a rattlesnake's tail was a constant, whispered threat. They traveled on foot, a small, determined band of four. Cole, his back still a map of angry burns and his leg a constant, throbbing ache, moved with a grim purpose that defied his injuries. Eliza walked beside him, the shotgun held in a steady, ready grip, her face set in a mask of fierce resolve. Louisa followed, her saddlebags now filled with water and bandages instead of herbs, her presence a quiet promise of healing in this place of certain violence. And Hank, his hand resting on Louisa's shoulder for guidance, moved with a strange, unnerving confidence, his senses alive to the subtle language of the desert, the skitter of a lizard, the shift of the wind. They found the place tucked into a narrow box canyon, a single dilapidated line shack and a corral, almost invisible against the red rock walls. It was Pike's secret storehouse, the hub for his illicit operations. They crept to the canyon rim as dusk began to bleed purple and gray across the sky, and watched. Two men lounged by a small fire, their rifles leaning against a stack of crates. A third man, Sable Quinn, sat apart, cleaning a long-barreled pistol, his movements economical and precise. A string of 4 pack horses laden with heavy-looking panniers stood tethered nearby. The plan was simple, born of desperation. Cole would create a diversion, drawing the guards away from the shack. In the confusion, Eliza and Louisa would get inside and retrieve the ledger and the spool of telegraph wire. The physical proof of the conspiracy. Hank, their secret weapon, had his own task. Cole took a handful of small stones and moved silently along the canyon rim to a position overlooking the far side of the camp. Eliza and Louisa slipped down a narrow wash that led to the back of the shack. Hank remained on the rim, a still, dark silhouette against the last of the light. The first stone Cole threw clattered down a rock slide, a sharp, unnatural sound in the evening quiet. The two guards by the fire jumped to their feet, grabbing their rifles. Quinn did not even flinch, his head just tilting slightly. Listening. A second volley of rocks from a different spot confirmed their fears. They were not alone. The two guards, yelling nervously to each other, moved off into the shadows to investigate, leaving the camp exposed. It was the opening they needed. Eliza and Louisa moved fast, slipping through the back door of the shack. The inside was crammed with crates of ammunition, rifles, and what looked like blasting powder. On a rough wooden table lay the prize Simon Wheeler's ledger, and beside it, a large, heavy spool of clean, new telegraph wire. They grabbed them just as a shout from outside told them the diversion was over. As they ducked out the back door, Sable Quinn stepped from the shadows, blocking their path. His pistol was in his hand, held low and steady. He offered a thin, cold smile. "I did not figure Hart would have the sense to bring ladies along. Drop the books." From the rocks above, a rifle cracked. Cole's shot was not aimed at Quinn, but at the ground by his feet, spitting dirt and rock fragments into the air. Quinn dove for cover behind the stacked crates, returning fire. Eliza and Louisa scrambled into the wash, clutching the evidence. The canyon erupted into a chaos of gunfire and ricocheting bullets. Cole, using the terrain to his advantage, kept the guards pinned down, but Quinn was a different kind of fighter, a predator. He moved with a deadly grace, his shots precise and controlled. While the battle raged, Hank calmly untied a long leather strap from his belt. Attached to one end was a small, three-pronged grappling hook. He had used it for years to retrieve things he had dropped. He swung it once, twice, then let it fly. It sailed through the air and snagged perfectly on the tether rope that held the 4 pack horses. He pulled, hard. The rope snapped, and the horses, spooked by the gunfire, bolted, their panniers of Pike's money bouncing wildly as they galloped out of the canyon and into the open desert. The sight of the escaping money was too much for the two guards. They abandoned the fight and ran for their own mounts, chasing after their payroll. It was now just Cole and Eliza against Quinn. And then the odds shifted again, catastrophically. A fourth figure appeared, coming not from the camp, but from the trail leading into the canyon. It was Deputy Wade Lyle, and he was not alone. He had one arm clamped tightly around Jamie, a pistol pressed to the boy's head. The gunfire stopped. An absolute, ringing silence fell over the canyon. "Drop your weapons, Hart, or the boy dies!" Lyle screamed, his voice high and strained with panic. He was a cornered rat, and he was ready to do anything. Eliza's world went white. She stepped out from the cover of the wash, her hands empty, her heart a cold, dead weight in her chest. "Let him go. Wade, this is between us." Cole emerged from the rocks, his rifle held loosely at his side, his face a pale, taut mask of fury. Lyle laughed, a ragged, ugly sound. "It is a bit late for that." "Sheriff," he started backing away, dragging Jamie with him. Eliza took a step forward. "Trade me," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Take me. Let my son go." Lyle hesitated, his eyes darting between Cole and Eliza. It was the moment Cole had been waiting for. He raised his rifle in a fluid, practiced motion. He did not aim for the head or the chest. He aimed for the shoulder, for the nerve that would make the gun hand useless. The rifle cracked. Lyle screamed and crumpled, his arm going limp, the pistol clattering to the ground. Jamie, freed, ran sobbing toward his mother. But as Cole lowered his rifle, another shot rang out. Sable Quinn had stepped from behind the crates. His shot was deliberate, unhurried. The bullet caught Cole high in the chest, spinning him around. He staggered, a look of shocked surprise on his face, and then fell. A cry of pure rage tore from Eliza's throat. She snatched up the shotgun she had dropped. Quinn was already raising his pistol for a final, killing shot at the downed sheriff. Eliza fired. She did not aim to kill. She aimed for his hand, just as Cole had. The blast of buckshot shattered the pistol in Quinn's grip and sent him howling. Clutching a mangled hand, she ran to Cole's side. The wound was bad, blood soaking his shirt in a rapidly spreading dark circle. Louisa was already there, pressing a cloth to the wound, her face a mask of grim concentration. It was then that the true devil showed his face. Barrett Pike rode into the canyon. Flanked by 2 more of his men, he looked at the scene, at the wounded deputy, the disarmed gunman, and the bleeding sheriff, and he smiled. "Well, this is a tidy little scene," he said, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "Lyle, you are a fool. Quinn, you are a disappointment, and you, Hart, you are a dead man." He dismounted, walking over to the ledger Eliza had dropped. He picked it up. "This little book, and your life, will solve all my problems." What he did not see was Hank, who had slipped down from the rim in the confusion. In his hand, he held a small, peculiar device of his own, making a sharpened stylus attached to a small, hand-cranked cylinder of wax, all mounted on a wooden handle. It was his way of taking notes, of recording melodies. He called it his memory writer. As Pike spoke, his voice full of arrogant confession, Hank cranked the handle, the stylus vibrating, etching every damning word into the soft wax. Pike turned his cold eyes on Eliza. "And you, widow, you should have stayed out of men's business. Now you will watch him die." As he spoke, the wind began to howl, picking up a sudden, violent force. The sky, which had been clear, turned a bruised, angry yellow. Dust and sand began to swirl, obscuring the canyon walls in a thick, choking brown cloud. The bowcat, the dust storm, had returned. A sudden, biblical force of chaos. In the confusion of the rising storm, Pike's men fired wildly, but their targets were already ghosts in the swirling maelstrom. And then came a sound no one in that dry land had heard in months, a low rumble of thunder, a flash of lightning that illuminated the churning brown clouds, and then rain. Not a drizzle, but a deluge, a torrent of water that fell from the sky in thick, silver sheets. The dust turned to mud. The fire the guards had built was extinguished with a hiss. The rare, miraculous rain came down, washing the blood from the rocks, silencing the last echoes of the guns, as if trying to cleanse the very memory of the violence that had just stained that dry and bone-white place. The return from Drybone Canyon was a slow, agonizing procession. The cleansing rain had passed, leaving the air sharp and clean and the desert floor damp and smelling of life. They had fashioned a travois from 2 long poles and a blanket, and on it, Cole lay, drifting in and out of consciousness, his face pale and beaded with a cold sweat. Eliza and Hank pulled the travois, their steps slow and measured, while Louisa walked alongside, constantly checking Cole's wound, her face a study in worried concentration. They carried with them a heavy weight, a wounded man, a leather ledger filled with damning truths, and a small, wax cylinder that held a man's confession in its shallow grooves. They arrived in Mesquite Ford not as fugitives, but as harbingers of a painful reckoning. The sight of them, muddy, exhausted, and carrying their wounded sheriff, brought the town to a standstill. People emerged from their homes and businesses, their faces a mixture of confusion, suspicion, and dawning apprehension. By a stroke of fortune, their arrival coincided with the quarterly visit of Circuit Judge Miller, a stern, whiskered man who valued facts above all else. Court was to be convened in the town square. under the shade of the single, large cottonwood tree. It was there, with the entire population of Mesquite Ford as witnesses, that the truth was finally brought into the light. Hank was the first to present his evidence. He stood before the judge's makeshift bench, a simple table brought out from the general store, and held up his memory writer. He carefully placed the wax cylinder on its spindle and began to turn the small crank. A scratchy, tinny sound filled the air, and then a voice, unmistakably arrogant and clear, echoed across the silent square. Barrett Pike's voice. He spoke of bribes, of intimidation, of the fool Lyle and the disappointment Quinn, and of how the death of a troublesome sheriff would solve all his problems. The crowd listened, their faces turning from disbelief to shock, and then to a slow, burning anger. They looked from the small, blind musician to the powerful rancher, and for the first time, they saw the truth. Next, Eliza presented the ledger. Its pages opened for the judge to see Simon Wheeler's meticulous accounting of Pike's crimes. The final piece was the spool of telegraph wire. The clean splice, a clear testament to the tampered message that had started the whole lie. Barrett Pike blustered and denied everything, his face purple with rage, but the evidence was absolute. Wade Lyle, his arm in a sling, broke down completely, sobbing and confessing his role in the scheme, begging for mercy. Sable Quinn, his hand heavily bandaged, simply watched the proceedings with a cold, pragmatic detachment. When the judge turned to him, he spoke in a low, even voice. He admitted to his part in the ambush and the fire, his words devoid of remorse, but full of a weary acceptance of his fate. He would trade a full confession, detailing Pike's entire operation, for a lesser sentence. He had seen the cost of blind violence, he said, and he was tired of paying it for other men's greed. Judge Miller's verdict was swift and decisive. Barrett Pike and Wade Lyle were arrested and bound for the territorial prison. Sable Quinn was taken into custody, his testimony ensuring that Pike's network of corruption would be completely dismantled. The law, clumsy and misguided as it had been, had finally found its proper course. When the proceedings were over and the prisoners had been led away, a strange, uncomfortable silence fell over the town. The people of Mesquite Ford stood in small, awkward groups, unable to meet Eliza's gaze. They were the same people who had been ready to form a lynch mob, who had called her a traitor and Cole a murderer. The weight of their collective shame was a palpable thing in the clean, post-rain air. One by one, they began to approach her. A rancher whose wife had helped dig the irrigation ditch, a shopkeeper who had known Tom. They mumbled their apologies, their eyes downcast. Eliza accepted them not with triumph, but with a quiet, weary grace. Nora June, her dress singed and her face still smudged with soot, pushed her way through the crowd. She threw her arms around Eliza, a gesture of fierce, unwavering loyalty. "Well," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, her old wit returning like a welcome friend. "My inn may have burned to the ground, but I will tell you one thing, the rumors in this town are now hotter than the fire, and for the first time, they are finally burning in the right direction." A ripple of relieved laughter went through the crowd, breaking the last of the tension. The community had been broken, but in that shared moment of truth and shame, it had also begun to heal. The most urgent healing, however, was yet to come. Cole had been carried to Louisa's small, clean home, and now he lay on her spare bed, his breathing shallow, a deep fever beginning to take hold. The bullet was still lodged in his chest, dangerously close to his lung. Louisa's home became a makeshift operating theater. She sterilized her instruments in boiling water, the lamplight glinting on the sharp steel. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic herbs. Eliza stood by her side, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her hands were steady as she held the lamp, her presence a silent, unwavering vigil. With a surgeon's skill, Louisa made the incision. The work was delicate, tense. The only sounds in the room were the soft clink of metal against a porcelain bowl, Louisa's quiet, focused breathing, and the ragged sound of Cole's own fight for life after a long, heart-stopping search, Louisa's forceps found the piece of lead. She drew it out, a small, misshapen lump of metal that had caused so much pain, and dropped it with a final, definitive click into the bowl. She stitched the wound with the neat, precise sutures, then applied a clean bandage. The danger was not over. She warned Eliza. The next few days would determine whether the fever would break or consume him. For 2 days and 2 nights, Eliza did not leave his side. She bathed his face with cool water, forced sips of broth between his parched lips, and listened to his fevered, disjointed murmurs. She sat in the quiet of the small room, the weight of the past week settling upon her. She looked at his face, peaceful now in a deep, healing sleep, and she felt the walls she had built around her own heart begin to crumble. On the second night, as the moon cast a pale, silver light through the window, she found herself speaking, her voice a low whisper in the stillness. "I was so afraid of the law," she said, not sure if he could even hear her. "I was afraid of it because it took Tom from me. I thought it was just a cold, blind thing that broke people without a second thought. I hated the badges, the guns, the certainty of it all." She reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. Her touch was feather-light. "But watching you, seeing you run into that fire for Jamie, seeing you choose to wound a man instead of kill him, even when your own life was on the line, it was not the law I saw. It was a man. It was a heart. I think I am beginning to understand. I was afraid of the law because I lost someone I loved. But maybe the law, when it has a heart, is the very thing that keeps us all here, together." A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She did not wipe it away. It was a tear of grief, of relief, of a profound and startling new hope. He stirred, his hand moving slightly on the blanket, his fingers brushing against hers. He did not wake, but the small contact was an answer. A few days later, the fever broke. He woke to find her asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head slumped at an uncomfortable angle, her face softened by exhaustion. He watched her for a long time, the woman who had saved him in every way a person could be saved. When she finally woke and found him looking at her, his gray eyes clear and lucid, a slow smile spread across her face, a smile of such pure, unadulterated relief that it made his own weary heart ache. He reached for her hand, his grip weak but firm. She came and sat on the edge of the bed, her hand held tightly in his. They did not speak for a long time. There were no words for what had passed between them. Gratitude was too small a word. Trust was too simple. He gently pulled her closer. She leaned down, and he met her halfway, his lips touching hers in a kiss that was not about passion, but about a deep and quiet homecoming. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a silent promise of a future that had been bought at a terrible price. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his, and they stayed like that, their hands clasped together. Two wounded souls finding their shelter not in a place, but in each other. The season turned, bringing with it a deep, healing quiet. The scars on the land and on its people began to fade, replaced by the steady, hopeful rhythm of rebuilding. Cole's recovery was slow but complete. The wounds on his body healed, and the deeper wounds to his name and his spirit were mended by the unwavering trust of a few good people. The territorial marshal rode into Mesquite Ford, listened to the whole story, reviewed the evidence, and officially reinstated Cole as sheriff. His authority now cemented not just by a badge, but by the hard-won respect of the community he had bled to protect. Mesquite Ford was a changed town. The fear that had been Barrett Pike's primary currency was gone, replaced by a cautious but determined sense of unity. The first and most visible sign of this new life was the resurrection of the Juniper House. Nora June, funded by a town collection and a generous loan from a guilt-ridden town council, was overseeing the construction with the energy of a general commanding an army. The air was filled with the clean scent of fresh-cut pine and the sounds of hammers and saws. One afternoon, as Cole was walking his slow, deliberate rounds, he stopped by the construction site. Nora stood on the newly laid foundation, directing two carpenters with a series of sharp, precise gestures. A new sign, freshly painted, was leaning against a stack of lumber. It was a wanted poster, done in the same style as the old one, but the sketch was a comical caricature of a heart wearing a sheriff's badge. The words beneath it read, "Most Wanted Heart," for the crimes of stealing the town's respect and running off with the affection of its finest widow. Cole felt a slow smile spread across his face. Nora caught his eye and gave him a theatrical wink. Just a little something to remind folks that some kinds of crime do pay. Sheriff, it is good for business. The town's new heart was most evident in the projects that grew from the ashes of the conflict. Eliza, no longer a recluse on her own land, had become a quiet but powerful force in the community. She had organized the small ranchers into a cooperative, and with the town's backing, the irrigation ditch they had started in desperation was now being expanded into a permanent water system, a shared resource for all. The fund she established, seeded with the money recovered from Pike's fleeing pack horses, ensured that no family would ever be driven from their land by thirst again. Luisa Ortega's small adobe house was also transformed. With funds from the same community chest, she had built a proper clinic, a clean, whitewashed building with 2 rooms and a sign above the door that simply said, "Healer." She treated everyone, from the Anglo ranchers and their families to the Apache and Mexican people who had for so long been forced to live on the margins. Her clinic was a place where all wounds, both of the body and of the old, deep-seated divisions, could be tended. And on the porch of the newly rebuilt general store, Hank sat with his guitar, his unseeing eyes turned toward the sound of the hammers and the voices of the town. He was no longer just a musician. He had become the town's historian, its poet. He had woven the entire saga into a long, mournful, but ultimately hopeful ballad. He called it the Ballad of the Gentle Sheriff. He sang of a storm of dust and lies, of a woman's stubborn kindness, of a fire that revealed a hero, and of a cleansing rain in a canyon of bone. People would stop their work to listen, and the children would sit at his feet, learning the story that was already becoming their own founding myth, a lesson in the difference between law and justice. The most profound change, however, was a quiet one, taking place within the small circle of Eliza, Cole, and Jamie. As Cole grew stronger, he spent more and more of his time at Eliza's ranch. He helped her mend fences, his movements still careful but growing more confident each day. He taught Jamie how to track a rabbit and how to carve a whistle from a piece of willow wood. He brought a sense of quiet, steady strength to the small homestead, a feeling of completeness it had not known since Tom's death. One hot, still afternoon, the 3 of them were by the well. The old bucket rope had frayed, and Cole was showing Jamie how to splice a new one, his large, scarred hands moving with a surprising dexterity as he guided the boy's smaller ones. Eliza was leaning against the well housing, watching them, a soft, peaceful expression on her face. Jamie held up the finished splice, his brow furrowed in concentration as he inspected their work. It looked strong. "Uncle Cole," he said. Cole smiled. "It is. It will hold." They attached the new rope and lowered the bucket, bringing it up full of cold, clear water. Jamie took the dipper and, after taking a long drink himself, he held it up to Cole. "Here, Pa," he said, the word as natural and unforced as the water flowing from the dipper. The world seemed to stop. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Cole froze, the dipper halfway to his lips. He looked at Jamie, who was looking back at him with a simple, unquestioning acceptance of a child. There was no grand pronouncement, no tearful scene. It was just a word that meant everything, a word that took 3 broken people and made them a family. Cole's eyes met Eliza's over the boy's head, and in that shared look, 1,000 unspoken promises were made and accepted. He slowly took the dipper from his son and drank. The cool water a balm to a thirst he had carried in his soul for a very long time. That evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the desert sky. The air was cool and smelled of sage and damp earth. In the distance, a sound drifted on the night air, long and lonesome and full of the promise of faraway places. The whistle of the night train, a reminder of the wider world, of the relentless march of time and progress that was slowly, inevitably, taming the wild land they called home. Eliza leaned her head on Cole's shoulder. She thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. The West is still wild, she thought to herself. It always will be. But I have learned that a person's heart can be a home, a shelter stronger than any storm. Later, when Jamie was asleep, she brought something out to the hearth where a small fire was burning against the night's chill. It was the old, creased wanted poster, the one that had brought so much fear into her life. She looked at it for a long moment, at the crude drawing and the bold, lying words. It was a relic from another life. She handed it to Cole. He took it, looked at it, and then, without a word, he folded it and placed it gently into the flames. They watched together as the paper curled, blackened, and was consumed, the lies turning to ash and smoke. The last thing to burn was the bold, black heading, "Most Wanted." From the doorway to his room, a small, sleepy voice spoke. Jamie stood there, rubbing his eyes. "What are you doing?" he asked. "We are just getting rid of some old trash," Eliza said softly. Jamie watched the last of the poster disappear into the embers. He yawned. "Good," he said, his child's logic simple and profound. "It can help keep us warm this winter." Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. And please consider subscribing to our channel Wild West Night, liking this video, and supporting us further by pressing the hype button so this story can reach more listeners.